Hi, welcome back to Cubs and Culture for February 10th, 2018. Continuing with our exploration of the Inarritu filmography. We're to 21 Grams, which is his second film, his first English language film after Love's a Bitch. The movie's storyline is spliced and fractured, so you're constantly moving backwards and forwards around basically the act climaxes and the initiating event. It's relatively easy to put the pieces into together, but so what I mean is, like the first shot you see is actually towards the end of the movie. The first shot you see in the movie is towards the end of the story. The middle's actually the beginning, and the end is sort of the begin. The end of the movie is sort of the beginning of the story. It's not backwards like it is in Memento. It's the time the cinematic playing around with time is more complicated than just moving backwards. So it moves forwards and backwards, and it centers around, if you put the story into chronological order, it's this ex-convict named Jack ends up having sort of a bad couple of days because he gets fired and he has issues. He's turned to religion as sort of this source of comfort. He ends up, so that's the first sort of events in the story. He ends up getting fired and then kind of has a bad day, and he ends up on his birthday running over and killing two little girls and their father. Then that man's heart is donated, which goes into Sean Penn's, who's a mathematician, a character who has heart disease, and he's trying to, him and his girlfriend are having sort of a mid-relationship crisis, and so he's dealing with that. He gets this new heart. He becomes obsessed with trying to find out who it was, and so he tracks down Naomi Watts, Park. Mrs. Park is the last name, and she's dealing with her husband's and children's death, and then also being a having issues with drug and turning to it. And so eventually, they get into their Watts the man's that Penn kills Del Toro. Give me a moment. Del Toro, and so they track him down and kill him. Now that's pretty much the and through actually machinations of a plot, the hit doesn't go well, and Sean Penn's ends up being kind of shooting himself, and sort of ends up dying at the end, but on his deathbed is actually in the beginning of the movie. So it's all sort of messed up chronologically. Now the thing is, when movies do this, it is harder to put the pieces together as a viewer. So you better have a reason for doing this, and it better not be trying to hide like weaknesses in the story. Now, fortunately, I think not that anyone has done this, I think if you would take 21 Grams and sort of edit it together chronologically, not how it is in the film, but actually put the first scene in the story first, it would actually be a pretty good film. It would not be as good as it is in its current form, but the story would play. The story is deeply moving, and so like the three characters are sort of like Del Toro's character, the ex-convict Jack, is sort of his story is sort of about redemption and him trying to get over, trying to redeem himself for doing this terrible thing of killing these two little girls and their father, as well as being being an ex-convict, and then also it severely tests his religious faith, and all that stuff is really compelling. Likewise, Park and River, who are the last name Park is Naomi Watts, the mother. Her sort of descent into wrath or vengeance is very deeply compelling, and then River, who is the Sean Penn character. He's sort of hope in the film, and is given a second chance, a new life, and he ends up sort of wasting it, and all that sort of stuff. It plays against himself a lot, and it's compelling, and the fracturedness of it isn't trying to hide issues with like the writing or anything. I really like that. Actually, the most sympathetic character in the movie is Del Toro, Jack, who's the ex-convict. And in some ways, I actually think he's the protagonist of this sort of story, and he's the only one who sort of ends up in an okay place at the end. Now, with that being said, the movie is fractured and edited like in a blender, so the time is all messed up. Now, the reason for this, and I think it really okay. So sometimes when films do this, there's no freaking reason to do this. A good example of this is the Kill Bill Volume 1 and Volume 2. There's no reason for those films to not be in chronological order. The splice narrative doesn't really add anything. In this case, though, because 21 Grams is supposed to be sort of dealing with how we deal with death, and so this is why a lot when the life and death issues about how we process how we die basically was the movie dealing with, and every single person is sort of in a different sort of relationship to death. So like Del Toro, Jack causes death. Park has to deal with the grief of close ones dying. Where River has to deal with himself dying, etc. So there's that. So that's what the film is doing. It's dealing with how we process death. And because Sean Penn's character, the mathematician, is shown on his deathbed very early in the film, the fracturedness of the storylines comes across, or it's puts into our head this idea of deathbed memory, where he's sort of, now it's not in his head, it's not explicit or anything like that, but it's sort of the point of it is the narrative is fractured in this way, because it's what happens to us at the allegedly, like the life flashes before your eyes. So that's what the cutting back and forth does. There's also and then the other thing is, because the way in which the events are cut back and forth, it's mostly around like the car accident or the act climaxes, where of course the act climaxes are tragic events in people's lives because it's a tragedy. It comes across as like sort of fractured disassociations of memory. And so in that way, the fracturing of the narrative is justified, because the story would be perfectly fine as a story if it was put in chronological order. It's the editing and the decision to break it apart and flash back and forth adds something to it, that the extra effort it takes to put the narrative in order is worth it to have sort of the meditation or sort of the feeling of how memory is working when you're on your deathbed or dealing with tragic incidences. The direction, it's an Inarritu film, so the direction is absolutely solid. His camera is very, very alive. He does a lot of things to make you aware in this film that there's a camera present in a good way, so it's almost like the sort of an observed camera, like fly on the wall type stuff. It's almost sort of docudrama in places. The other thing I like about it, and this helps with sort of keeping track of the story threads, it's a bit like in Traffic, where most of the stuff before the car accident has a bluish tint, and then the stuff that happens around the car accident has like a normal tint, and stuff after the car accident has like an orange tint. Now, it's not nearly as stark as it is in Traffic, where the segments are literally color-coded. It's just, you can tell, it's one of the ways in which you can tell to put the chronology together is sort of the color palette is subtly shifted depending on the chronology of the scene. And so that's really solid direction. It really does help put the narrative together. I like this better than Love's a Bitch. It might be his best early film, or the best one in the so-called Death trilogy, which is Love's a Bitch, 21 Grams, and Babel, which I'll talk about next. The last thing, of course, is the acting is really, really good in this film. Watts and Del Toro were nominated for Oscars, and Sean Penn probably was not nominated because he was nominated for Mystic River instead, which is kind of funny to me because I like him better in 21 Grams and I like him than he was in Mystic River. Del Toro and Penn are actually kind of understated for them, and that's why I think it's a sort of a better performance. Don't get me wrong, Penn is good in Mystic River as sort of a raw, as a powerful, raw, emotional, overstated in a good way performance. But here he's fairly subdued for him, and it comes across far more touching and sort of much more empathetic or sympathetic than he is in Mystic River. And so I don't understand why he wouldn't want this one nominated, but whatever. Academy. Watts, on the other hand, gives a absolutely blistering, emotional, Watts is as overstated and emotionally raw and powerful as Sean Penn is in Mystic River. And I like her performance, but it's important that she has that because she's sort of the one who, that character